At the Home Depot, we make it easy to turn your to-do list into a done list with our speedy delivery options. Need something in a hurry? We offer next day and even same day delivery on a wide variety of products. The best part is you can order straight from your couch. Our team is ready to help and get your order to you same day if it's placed by 4 p.m. on select products. When shopping online, filter by delivery to see availability options. Delivery at the speed you need, only at the Home Depot.
We are back on the Falcons Audible presented by AT&T. At some point, DJ Shockley might break out into a freestyle because that's what he was doing right before we came on the podcast. See, we're feeling it, right? Yeah. Because there was no conversation amongst us three that we all went black on the top and almost nailed it with the old school logo, but Arch still's got the new logo. Although you said right before.
I thought about it.
You thought about it.
That's almost good enough. You thought about it.
Yeah, you'd think. You guys actually you guys wore this logo, right?
I wore this one, and then I went to that one.
Yeah, so that was the only one that I was fortunate enough to wear as a player.
Yeah, so it's like
you'd
nowadays.
Think I'd go that route.
Arch, you know this too. Probably not so much shock, but when they do the throwbacks, it's like that's what I wore. That was the jersey that I wore. When you end up being in the you wore the red helmet. Like I actually never wore the red helmet, which is really cool. But certain things in life always just kind of make you hits a little different.
Let you know you grew up a little bit, huh? That's what it is.
Thank you. That's a very good way to say it.
I think we did that.
I said last week on the show as we wrapped up the season that we may not be back for very long. Well, guess what?
Psych, we lied.
Here we are. Just can't get enough of us three. So this will be the first of many off-season shows. And as we did mention last week, we will be back when there are some bigger moments that happen in the off-season. And as I mentioned, periodic updates and analysis, including everything Falcons related, combine, free agency, draft, and to make sure that you're tuned into AtlantaFalcons.com, the YouTube channel, and all of your other areas where you get your social media. They actually wrote down here, wherever you do your social media-ing. I didn't know that was a word, but sometimes you can just, as long as you sell it, you can just make it work.
You just did. You did a good job with it.
Just sell it. Like, wherever you do your social media-ing, you'll find us, okay? So there was a bigger moment that happened with the Atlanta Falcons organization last week after a thorough review of the coaching staff. Head coach Raheem Morris decided to part ways with defensive coordinator Jimmy Lake and defensive line coach Jay Rodgers. So guys, Shock, I'm going to start with you. Kind of initial reactions when you heard this news. It broke. You probably got an email, and then everybody else nationally ended up seeing the news. What was your first impressions?
You know what? With how long I think time had went on, and I say it long as in, the season ended. It was probably a week or so later, and then it finally happens. You probably thought nothing was going to happen, but you also look back on some of the signs. You look back on some of the things that Raheem talked about in his last press conference, and even after the last ball game, the first thing he mentioned was we did not play well enough on defense, and you could tell that was something that was really stuck in the craw of his mind. And, you could tell he was really not in a good place with how the defense played. And then you look at, some of the things that transpired over the last, month of the season, and you say, you know what, this defense did not continue the growth that you would want. And the other part about it is I think a lot of people have to realize and kind of understand is this was probably a really, really tough decision. Yeah. Because of the personal side of it. And sometimes you always, as a head coach, you got to try to separate the personal and separate the business part of it and be the best for this organization. And I think we all remember when Rod got the job and he talked about, how much he loved having Jimmy Lake, how much they talked about when he got a job that he was going to be a part of it. And to have to separate that from the personal side and say, I got to do what's best for the organization, that had to be tough as well. So, these guys are human as well. You guys got to think about probably, separating yourself from one of your really good friends in a business that you guys have kind of started together. So not doing it was doing it was probably a big part of that. But you look back some of the things that happened last couple ball games. You get 155 rush yards to Carolina, 216 to Washington, 115 to Minnesota. There's some other glaring stats that, when you go back and look at it, you say, you know what? This defense did not grow as we expected it to as the season went on, especially with the amount of veterans that you had on this ball club, especially on that side of football. So I thought just the lack of growth as the season progressed was a big part of why this decision probably was made at the end of the season.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those, I think it's a great point that you make, DJ, and a lot of the viewers and listeners are going to think, well, this is the National Football League. I mean, people get fired all the time, but it's like when you kind of try to put it into perspective how different this business is than most every other business, it's not very often that you mention that a guy gets hired that's uniquely qualified, that you actually got a really close relationship, that 1 year later – you end up firing them. It's not good enough. And I guess it does happen probably at higher levels of larger organizations, but that's how things work in the National Football League, is that if the results, the performance is not there, changes have to be made. There's a number of different areas that you can look at, but I think the point that Shock makes was the amount of veterans and the people that were on this defense, the acquisition of Matthew Judon right before the season started. You're thinking, okay, there's pieces to the puzzle there where they should be better on pass rush, they should be better stopping the run, they should be better on points allowed, and maybe even takeaways as well is probably where he looked at all those areas and says, if we want to get into the postseason, we have to make a change now.
Yeah, that's the only way you can do this, right? Is you got to evaluate, why did things certainly happen? I was writing my notes down about this, and so you evaluate why. So where were we? What were some of the things that went on? Were we on the same page as a staff? One thing that probably needs to be pointed, you're not going to fire everybody on the team. Okay, so the players aren't going anywhere. So somebody ultimately ends up holding the bag on this deal. And so normally it's one of the coordinators. It might even be a position coach, as it turned out you let your defensive line coach go as well. So why would some of those things happen? And so now you're going to go back and evaluate, okay, were we on the same page throughout? Did we have the same idea as to how we were going to develop? Why didn't that develop? Why were certain players put in positions to be as successful as they could possibly be? Some of the things that I know were seen and some things that I watched, Matthew Judon dropping off in coverage. Mm-hmm. We saw that numerous times during the year, and you're kind of scratching your head going, wait a minute, he's brought here to rush the passer. The guy had 35 sacks in 39 games coming in, his last 39 games. Why is he dropping off in coverage? So some of those ideas of scheme and what you were trying to do, did it mesh with what we had in mind when we went and got those players? Yep. And are we giving them the best opportunity to be as good as they can possibly be? That ultimately is why it took as long as it did, because there was an evaluation. I know there was some people talking about, why is it taking us so long to make that decision? We weren't very good on defense. No, we were good on defense in a number of places, a number of times during the year, but it was too inconsistent. Why were we inconsistent? That's why it takes as long to evaluate what you're going to do there. And ultimately, they decided that they weren't meshing in their minds and their scheme-wise, and that's why you move forward and move on. So just to give the fan a little bit of a background, I know I had a number of people ask me, and I've heard people say locally on the radio here in Atlanta, why did it take so long to make this decision? Well, you guys talked about the personal piece of it. I'm talking about the schematic piece of it. You combine those two things, there's a lot to evaluate there. So that's why we're where we are now.
Let me add one last thing to this kind of to this conversation. And I was looking up some numbers and looking up the schematic part of it came to mind for me. And I started thinking about, okay, where did things kind of go a little bit off? And obviously the sacks were a big part of it. 31st in the league with 31 sacks. And you say, okay, that's a part of not being able to get to the quarterback. And then it also contributes to the back end as well. This number I thought was staggering. I didn't even realize it was a particular stat, but it was. The Falcons were last in the league. Teams were completing 69.9% of their passes against them. That tells you, first, you're not getting to the quarterback, and then it makes it easy on these quarterbacks in this league to throw the football over the yard. And we saw it through the year. There were guys open. There were time to throw the football. Guys had their career days against us in these ball games. So those kind of correlate and go hand in hand with each other. If you can't get to the quarterback, and then you're also giving that quarterback time in this league, the best of the best playing that position, couple of the smartest guys on the field, they're going to hurt you. So ultimately, I think that's part of the problem as well. Is schematically, if you can't get to them and you're not really holding guys off, I don't know how you're going to be able to hang around.
Yeah, we saw it throughout the year early on where we saw a lot of veteran quarterbacks early in the season. You know, the Patrick Mahomes and people like that of the world that have the ability to stretch you and make plays down the field were playing the keyboard. They were taking what you were giving them.
Yeah.
And so we, you know, the idea of meshing pass rush up with what we're doing in the back end, Shock makes a great point. The only way you can get to the quarterback is to make him hold the football. If we're not doing something on the perimeter to make him wait and make receivers redirect and all those kind of things, then it's not meshing. And that's where some of this conversation, I'm sure, and evaluation went in as they went back and looked at all 17 games.
There was a lot of common themes to what you guys were saying there, and the word that you guys kept saying over and over and over that just resonates with me is schematic and scheme, right? And in the National Football League, there's two things that you have to win, in my opinion. And this might be oversimplified. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but you need players, first and foremost. You need really good players, and you have to have a scheme that allows them to be successful, which that comes from coaching. All right? I'm going to flip this over. I know we're talking about defense, but I'm going to talk about offense for a second. Think about these teams that I'm going to talk about. Baltimore, Buffalo, Kansas City. I'd even throw the Rams in there. You've got players, quarterbacks, wide receivers. You've got some of the more bright offensive minds from a scheme perspective that get these teams, get these players open, get the football in their hands, right? So the same thing could be said on the defensive side of the ball. I went and looked up who the number one team total defense this year in the National Football League was. DJ's going to like this one. The Philadelphia Eagles, right? Yards per game. Where have they invested a lot of their assets? Up front on the defensive line, right? And not only that, so they've got the players, but the scheme is also fit, and that's part of the reason why they got in the postseason, because they're a really good defense. Yeah, they got Saquon Barkley, but it's so much about scheme. And I think that's what Raheem Morris looked back and he said, we have to have a scheme change. So, guys, let's talk a little bit about what Atlanta needs to look for in the next defensive coordinator, even defensive line coach, if you want to go down that road as well. Now, let me make this quick disclaimer. The thoughts and opinions that we have here on names or anything are solely ours. They don't come from the organization. We don't have our ears to the wall to the coaching staff or the personnel department and know which direction they're going. We're just talking about some players or some coaches that might be available if we get into names that we think are potential good fits. But what is Atlanta looking for, Arch, in your opinion, in their next defensive coordinator?
Well, you're looking at what everybody's looking for. I want to rush the passer. I want to take the football away. I want to win on third down and in the red zone.
That's easy.
Yeah, there you go.
Easy enough.
Let's go find those guys. But it's what you're talking about is the meld of what you have on this roster, because you're not going to. What do we got? You got 69 guys. If you count the practice squad guys. 69 guys on the roster. 33 of those guys are defensive players. You're not changing all 33 players.
Yeah.
So you're talking about maybe switching out at most 10 guys on the defensive side, 8 guys on the defensive side. So who is the guy that's going to be able to come in and blend with what you have talent-wise? And this is a talented team. You've got guys that are coming in, you got a guy like Arnold Lebakades coming into his own. You've got the number 7 tackler in the National Football League in Caden Ellis at the second level. You've got one of the best safeties in the entire league in Jesse Bates, maybe one of the best corners in the league. You've got talent on that side of the football, and there's some guys that are coming on. Maybe Ruka Roro is that next guy that's going to be a dominant interior defender. We saw at moments that happened. What does Brandon Dorless bring to the table? What if you get Braylon Trice back on the field? What does he do? So you've got some talent on this team that's been drafted and brought in free agency. So now I've got to find a guy that matches and you're going to have to listen to the vision. So when you're interviewing a guy, and you guys know this, if you've got a guy coming in the building, there's been names thrown out there. Lou Anarumo's name has been thrown out there. Outstanding defensive coordinator in Cincinnati. Worked with Jesse Bates. He's going to be in the building here, or at least they're going to talk to him. He's a guy you need to talk to. A guy's been very successful in the National Football League. Helped get Cincinnati to a Super Bowl here about 3 years ago. Helped them almost win a Super Bowl. Very close against the Rams. But can he mesh what is his vision for the guys that you have up front? What is his vision for that second? What are we going to do in that front 7 that's going to create offensive line problems, trying to get guys blocked? That's what the whole conversation is going to be about. You guys know that as well as I do. And how do you blend it, as Shock said, with the back end? And do those guys talents match. Okay, we want to come up and play press. We're going to play press. We're going to play man coverage all over the field. I'm going to have a single safety in the back end. We're going to rock the safety down the box. Does that match what we have?
Yeah.
Or does it not? So that's what the whole conversation is going to be.
DJ, have you had a chance to think more? I mean, I think Arch hit it, like the four biggest areas where you're successful on defense, and finding somebody that not only has the right vision, but is able to communicate it to Raheem Morris in their interviews, and then take the players that's on this roster, the core players that you know are going to be back. Because, guys, at this point, we don't really know, outside of a few guys that you mentioned, they are going to be there next year, but there could be some other guys that are not, just because of salary cap situation, because of trying to make the numbers and the work with players and everything. But what else has to happen with this hire in order for Atlanta to get it right?
I think Arch did a good job of breaking down some of the stuff that's ultra important, and I think philosophically you have to be a little bit different than you were last year. And we talked about some of the things that makes this defense really good and the type of players you have, but I think it comes down to, are you going to change the roles of some of these guys like Arch mentioned? Like, are we going to be more aggressive going after the quarterback? You look over at Minnesota, who obviously they lost the other night, but they were a team who were really aggressive. They were more aggressive than most teams that you face. Or there's other teams that sit back and play a lot of coverage. But does that fit the type of players you have going in? So I think that's going to be a big part of it, is how do you emphasize the strengths of what these guys can do that you know they're going to be in the building? So if you come into an interview with Raheem Morris, you say, look, I've watched a bunch of tape on A.J. Terrell. I feel like he's so much better when he's in this role as opposed to some of the things he did last season. And if that fits, then okay, let's move forward with that. You look at red zone. That's a big part of the team, big part of winning ball games. And I think ultimately you got to think about next year, this is going to be a really good team offensively. You're going to score a lot of points. So how can you slow people down? How can you create more turnovers? This last season, the Falcons were 31st in the league in giving up touchdowns. They gave up 34 touchdowns this last season. That's 31st in the league. So a lot of that, may came from outside the 20, but a lot of that came within the red zone. What's your strategy? What's your philosophy inside the red zone to kind of pump the brakes when people get down there? And I think that's a big part of it as well. So philosophically, whoever comes in, I think there has to be a change in how this defense looks going forward as opposed to what we saw last year. And there were times where, you saw some really cool stuff that Jimmy Lake drew up that gave guys opportunities. We talked about Caden Ellis, his ability to rush the passer and creating those avenues. A lot of five-man fronts where he was the guy that was rushing or he was dropping, and you got other guys coming off the edge. So I think there's a lot of differences that you can use, a lot of guys that you can actually use in this defense to give you an advantage. But I think coming in, whoever that guy is, he has to make it known specifically about certain guys in certain situations, how he feels. That gives Raheem a little bit of a pause on, okay, maybe that's better than what we did last year.
Arch, I'm kind of going to surprise you on this a little bit, but excuse me. Is this a situation where you think this next coordinator has to be a previous coordinator? Because we saw Zach Robinson coming in, getting his first opportunity as an offensive coordinator, being an offensive guy working under Sean McVay. But do you think this is one where Raheem's going to have somebody that has been a coordinator in the NFL before?
I do. I think that you need a guy with experience that has understanding of how to – and Shock talked about, what are we going to be? I think he's got to be able to shift gears. If you're playing Lamar Jackson, is the quarterback you're facing, there's probably going to be a little bit different plan put together than if you're playing, Justin Herbert, who's going to stand in the pocket a little bit more, stay in the pocket. So a guy that has the ability to shift gears within the confines of your scheme and still show that aggressiveness or however you want to play, but still make a little nuances that's going to be able to stop the run. If I'm facing Baltimore, the number one concern is to stop the run game.
Yep.
I need to find a way to get Derrick Henry stopped, right? That's what Buffalo's going to have to deal with in the playoffs this weekend. If I'm playing Kansas City, my number one concern is probably Patrick Mahomes and what is he going to do and getting the tight end stopped, and taking away some of those plays. So I think a coordinator that's been in the mix and had to make those adjustments during the week, each week, I think that's going to fall on a guy that's been a coordinator before. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think to your point, it's like somebody that's been through the ringer that said, okay, this player has been really good here, but has the creativity to think, well, maybe he ends up playing a little bit more here, and he's got some results that can show for it too. Like I think about the Zach Bond move for Philadelphia, right? Like when they went out and got him, he was not really a difference maker, and he ended up leading the league or close to leading the league in tackles, and even first team All-Pro player this year. So like kind of the vision that you can have for different players when you bring them into the organization, number one, and then find the role that you feel like they're the uniquely qualified to fill. But would you agree, Shock, that it's got a previous coordinator experience in the NFL or even college game? If we open it up, maybe it's a respected college defensive coordinator. Is that important, do you believe?
I do. And I love the fact you went college, too, because it gives a different feel coming into the college game versus the pro game, and maybe there's some things that are going on that level that's a little bit different from what maybe offenses see now coming into the National Football League. So I love the fact that you have a guy who's been there, done it. I love the fact you have a guy who understands what it takes in this league with how different it can change weekly, like Art just mentioned, as far as personnel, that you can make those in-game. Obviously, you got to make a lot of adjustments during the week, but we know if games are won with the adjustments you make in-game, within series, things that you can see right off the bat and say, you know what, I can go back to a moment where I seen this, 2 years ago and say, you know what, I know what they do in these situations. So I love the fact that you could have one of those kind of guys who's been there, done it, but also has that experience and to be in those moments, to be able to make those changes when you need them.
And I'm of the opinion, guys, and I'd love to hear what you guys think of this. And again, my opinion, you're going to need to move on this fairly quickly. You're going to have, you got 4 or 5 guys that you want to talk to. Well, there's 7 openings in the National Football League as a head coach.
Yeah, good call.
Those guys are going to want to talk to those guys too. The quicker you can get your guy hired, and I'm not talking about rush just to get a guy. Make sure you get the right guy, but it has to be done with a sense of urgency here because there are opportunities. Let's say, Ben Johnson, who's one of the top coordinators right now for the Lions, gets one of these jobs. He's going to have guys he's going to want to take with him. He's going to have relationships with guys he's going to take. So you need to kind of strike while the iron's hot here a little bit where guys are available. I think Atlanta's doing that. We talked about they're going to interview Lou Anarumo. There's a number of guys. There's guys in this building that they're going to talk to. I'd be surprised if Jerry Gray's not talked to. Jerry Gray's been a very good defensive coordinator in the National Football League. You back to his time in Buffalo in 2004, 2005, they were the number 2 defense in the league back-to-back years. Talk about a guy like Jeff Ulbrich, a guy that has been in this building before, has coached with Raheem Morris. Jeff Ulbrich has had a top 5 defense in New York with all the stuff that's going on with their quarterback up there for the last 3 straight years. They've been in either 3 or 4 in the National Football League. Even this year when he took over as an interim head coach, they were number 4 in the league on defense. Now, you say, well, they got some dudes on that. Yeah, they got some dudes, but they got a guy coordinate like you were talking about, putting guys in position to be the best they can possibly be. Now, Steve Wilkes' name, as I know, is out there. He's had dominant defenses in Carolina and in San Francisco. These are just a few of the names. And again, my opinion of guys are going to look at, but I do think you need to strike now and not wait because I think some of these guys, the other people know these guys are pretty good too, and they're going to grab these guys.
What about Dave Archer? What about Dave Archer?
Coordinating defense?
Yeah.
Only if you come with me, Shaq.
Yeah.
I got to have my. I put you on the D-line. Hey, coach, could you coach the D-line?
You make a good point, though, Arch, because not only the guys that are going to be named head coach, remember, there was already one named, Mike Vrabel. Now, Mike Vrabel's probably out there looking for some staff right now. And if again, you can't rush. You got to find the right guy that fits your organization. But that right guy that you think might fit the organization, Mike Vrabel might think he fits up in New England as well. And sometimes you can't necessarily control that. If somebody wants to coach with Mike Vrabel or they want to be in the Patriots organization more than this one, you can't really control that. But there are some factors that you have to consider. Guys, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about Terry Fontenot. He had his end-of-season press conference last week, and I wanted to get your guys' initial thoughts on that. Obviously, his big theme was the results speak for themselves. We didn't win enough football games, and so basically all the conversations are on the table. They kind of have to be when you're in the National Football League and you come up short of your goals. Not only this season, but I think in Terry Fontenot's tenure as the general manager, he has not won as many games as he wants as the general manager. So, DJ, what did you take away from some of the common themes coming away from Terry's press conference?
I think you hit it right on the head to start is took accountability for what this team was not this season. And I think coming as a GM, you have to hit that head on because a lot of people are going to look at you and say, you know what, you're a big part of the personnel that is here. You went out and said, all right, I want to draft this guy. You want to bring this guy in free agency. And I thought right off the top he took accountability for it, which was big. And I think obviously, a lot of guys will do that, but I love the sincerity of what he brought. You talked about it. We must do better to be better. And he talked about, hey, yeah, we could talk about it. The words matter, yeah, but we got to see results. And I think that's ultimately what you want to hear from the GM. I thought he did a good job of also talking about the frustration of the fans because I think sometimes when people see the GM, they're so far away from the actual fan that you don't think that they actually understand what you're going through. And I love the fact that he spoke to the frustration of the fans because he has that same frustration. So the fans know right away that, yeah, I'm still trying to do this to put the best product on the field for our fan base and go forward. I thought he was real specific in some of the things that he talked about. And I think what I mentioned it last week was we need more production out of the tight end position. And he hit it head on. He said, yeah, we haven't got what we wanted from this guy since his rookie season. And that wasn't, to call him out or anything, but he was asked a question and he answered it frankly, which I think a lot of fans feel the same way. Because you could talk about, hey, I understand your frustration. Fans, I hear you. And then you don't acknowledge it or even talk about the situation at hand. So I love the fact that he went about, talking about those different things head on that give you a little pause. But I think the biggest thing that he, obviously he has to be real kind of general in this moment because before that press conference, Jimmy Lake was still here. So I think some of the things he talked about was how we have to improve this team going forward. And it starts with free agency, starts with draft, starts with, looking at this whole entire roster, looking at the coaching staff. Like you said, everything's on the table. So even though it was, I wouldn't say typical general, coach or GM speak, I thought he was real frank about a certain couple topics that gave the fan base something to say, you know what, he hears us, he understands it, and he knows that these have to be better if this organization is going to be better.
Yeah, and Shock, I think this is a crucial offseason for Terry as well, because if you think about free agency and draft over the last couple years, I think you could probably make the argument it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. Like you bring in Caden Ellis, you bring in Jesse Bates. I mean, those are impact players. But you bring in, Matthew Judon doesn't necessarily work out, and obviously the Kirk Cousins situation has not worked out. We don't know how that's going to end up sifting out in the offseason. You mentioned the Kyle Pitts. You go out on a limb when you draft a tight end number 4 overall. Sure. And then he ends up having a really good rookie season, and since then it's been kind of underwhelming. So those are kind of the targets that get put on your back. You have to make difficult decisions when you're a general manager in the draft. You have to go out on a limb because you're convicted about somebody. They were convicted about Michael Penix, and it looks like now that might turn out to be a really good selection as things kind of shook out. But there's pressure always in that role, Dave, as the general manager, but maybe even more elevated for Terry this offseason.
And there's no question. I mean, it ramps up when you don't succeed, right? And you don't hit your goals. And the goals for this team was to win this division and be in the playoffs and have a chance to potentially do something special in the offseason dance or the postseason dance. So that didn't work out. So now you reevaluate. Are we headed in the right direction? There's got to be some conviction in what you were thinking was right, but you're going to try to find those indicators to verify, I do like the direction we're going. Obviously, they didn't like what was going on defensively, right. So they've made a change there after a lot of thought process and a lot going into it. Okay, can we do better there? Yeah, we can do better there. We can do better there from a coaching standpoint, and you can bet. We all know they can do better in a couple places from a player standpoint. So they're going to acquire players, as Shock talked about, with free agency in the draft, as you always do. But I do think Shock made a great point in that I think that for him to verbalize what the fan is feeling and understand there's a frustration here. You're 7 straight years out of the postseason, and so there's a frustration here. There's fans are wanting to come down. They're pulling for the team, trying to pull them through, and just can't quite get there. He identified that, and then to talk about maybe some of the little points as you discussed with the tight end or whatever, and he even talked at length about Kirk Cousins. That there's a lot of conversation going to happen around Kirk and what they do. But what he did say was, and maybe there's some clarity that needs to be put there. They're comfortable with him returning as their backup quarterback. Are you comfortable paying the quarterback that much money to be the backup? Probably not, but you're going to pay him anyway based on the situation. Would you rather have him play for another team like Denver had to pay Pittsburgh to play, or would it be better to have him here as a mentor? And he's shown that he's willing to potentially do that with a guy that has a ceiling that is through the roof when it comes to, or the sky's the limit with Michael Penix to have him around. So I thought that Terry did a really good job addressing it, but Rack, you're exactly right. We're now, the mulligans have been used, right? You kind of are at a point now where we need to go shoot 65.
Yeah. It's I love it.
That's the only shock. The only guy in here is that shot 65 is shock, by the way. That's a golf reference, by the way. Sorry.
Golf reference, by the way, and number one, it's like, we could just go out and shoot 65.
It's only 7 under.
Yeah, that's it. So, guys, I think about how the playoffs is kind of shaken out so far, right? You had the team that was in the same division in Tampa that ended up finishing 2 games ahead. They end up going and they play the team that you end up playing a couple weeks prior, and they lose, right? So,
and had played them in week 1 and won by 17 points. That's the way this league is, right?
And then you think about the Minnesota Vikings, guys. Like, 1 game. Week 18 from getting the number 1 overall seed.
14 wins,
14-3. And they get outplayed in the first round of the playoffs, and they're done. So think about them, how their season went. I mean, so much excitement, so much happiness. Everybody in the organizations was so excited about how this season went. They get to the postseason, which is where Atlanta wanted to go. They wanted to be 1 game further. The Minnesota Vikings have 14 wins. They're out.
Are you trying to say there's disappointment around the league?
There's disappointment all over the place. And you just never know what's going to happen, especially when you get in the dance. So, in the Atlanta Falcons, if they could have won 1 more game and get in the postseason, you never know what's going to happen.
That's true.
So, guys, before I close it, I'm just going to ask you this one simple question, and it might be an elephant in the room. It might be something that people didn't think about. But, Shock, what is the biggest thing on the plate for the Atlanta Falcons organization now as we are at this, call it 3rd week in January and moving forward? What's the biggest thing that's on their table right now?
I think it has to be, obviously, is hiring the next defensive coordinator, because that goes a long way into what you do defensively. And we talked about it last week. There are a lot of question marks on this defense with a lot of guys who are signed with a 1-year deal or maybe coming up on their last year on a deal or whatever. And you got to get that defensive coordinator here right away to start breaking down. And obviously, if he's going through this process, he's looked at this defense. He's done all his homework on the personnel that's in it, so he knows going into that interview what he needs to conversate with Raheem Morris about. So I think hiring that guy goes a long way into what happens next, especially on that side of football. And I think a lot of the conversation that we have this offseason will probably go on that side of the ball.
Yep.
And we talk about it in length about pass rush, obviously being a big deal, corner being another spot opposite A.J. Terrell. How happy are you with that guy? New defensive coordinator may say, you know what, hey, I need another guy who can do this as opposed to what's already in the room. Mm-hmm. One thing that came up to me was, what's going to happen at the inside linebacker? Mm-hmm. And you think about what you have now. You got Caden Ellis, who, it's a great player, did great things for you last couple of years. But I think he may be coming up on the last year of his deal maybe. You look at Troy Anderson. Guy's played 9 games in the last 2 years. You haven't gotten the production you want out of him. You go out and draft J.D. Bertrand, who played 12 games this season, was a solid player for you. But you look inside there, what are we going to do at inside linebacker? Because we know that's a critical part of the defense is that guy in the middle. We looked around the league and looked at guys who play in that spot right now on defenses who wear the green down their helmet. They're super important. So there's a lot of conversation that need to be had about this defense, but it starts with hiring the right guy like we've talked about for the last 25 minutes, and that guy has to come in with a direct correlation of what he wants to do with his personnel and this team.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those arcs where I feel like there are some difficult decisions probably on the defensive side that are going to have to be made, right? Some decisions at corner. You mentioned it. Mike Hughes, what's his future look like? Justin Simmons, Matthew Judon, even a guy like Grady Jarrett. I know that he has been the face of this franchise for a long time, but this new defensive coordinator has to come in and say, all right, here's my plan for 2025. Now let's look at the guys that are on this roster. Can I execute my plan? Can I execute what I want and what this organization needs with these guys, or do we have to make some difficult decisions in the offseason? I think those are the discussions, the difficult ones that are going to be coming up pretty quickly.
Yeah, for me, the number one concern is obviously coordinator, so I won't go coordinator, so I'm going to go salary cap. I mean, you're going to have to figure out, which is kind of what you're talking about, is, okay, what are we going to do to create room that if we don't have the guys in that defensive meeting room, how do we go get those guys? And where can we restructure or release or whatever it is to create that opportunity to go get a piece or two here to bring them in to meld with whatever our defensive coordinator is going to do. So defensive coordinator probably obviously the number one concern. I think salary cap, and I know they're already jockeying on what they want to do and trying to put together what it's going to look like when the league year kicks in. Who have we re-upped? Who have we let go potentially? Who have we designated as June 1?
You're making my head hurt with the math already.
So
the math.
But here's the whole idea. The reality of the GM and the salary cap guys and the personnel guys is there's multiple stuff going on around the. It's not just, okay, we're going to do this first, then we'll go to this, then we'll go. All this stuff is happening at the same time, and you're trying to mesh it together to where it comes together where when you hit the ground running.
So you got a big pot of gumbo, all kind of stuff sitting there. And you just kind of get through it, pick out the stuff you don't like. I don't like them onions. Pick them out. That's what you're going.
You pick out the onions in the gumbo.
I'm a big fan of the onions.
Come on, man.
Peppers, I don't need none of that stuff.
So there you have it, folks. Running an NFL team is like a perfect recipe of gumbo. I've never actually heard it said like that. But you just never know what
onions, evidently. No onions.
Sometimes DJ Shockley, hashtag no onions. Okay. Arch, great job today as always, DJ. I thought it was going to be like a few weeks, maybe a couple months before I saw you guys again, and it turned out to be 7 days. So it's great.
And we back.
And
by the way, listen to Rack. Rack's going to be on the radio. He's calling the big game of the weekend, calling Buffalo, Baltimore. Get ready.
Rack,
the two guys that are going for the MVP, Josh Allen, you got Lamar Jackson, you got Derrick Henry, you got James Cook. I mean, come on, man. That's going to be fun.
Huge matchup. So I was in Buffalo last weekend. I'm back up there this weekend. I hadn't been to Buffalo since I played there in the early 2000s.
Nice. Big jacket.
Yeah, I was already, because it's supposed to be colder this weekend than it was last weekend.
Are you tired of people asking if you got wings when you're in Buffalo?
No, not tired of it.
It is Buffalo.
Right.
Yes, it is Buffalo. But they're very well known. I've already gotten a couple of restaurant recommendations for this weekend. So anyway, yes, I'll be back in Buffalo as the NFL playoffs continue. And again, the tournament that the Atlanta Falcons are looking to get themselves into in 2025. So as we said, we'll be back for the bigger moments of the offseason. Maybe this organization ends up hiring a defensive coordinator. We'll be back sooner than later. But until then, thanks so much for joining us on the Falcons Audible presented by AT&T. That's hashtag no onions, DJ Shockley. This is Dave Archer. I'll get a hashtag for him next week. I'm Derek Rockley. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on the Falcons Audible.